All right, good afternoon from Austin, Texas. My name is Jarrett Way, Marketing Manager here at Mighty Citizen, and today we're here for the You're a Publisher Now webinar. I want to thank you all for attending today, and before we get started, I want to go over just a few housekeeping items. The first thing is that this webinar will go for about 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So if you have any questions that arise during the webinar, please post them in the questions area, and we'll look at those throughout the presentation today. The second item is that we will send the slides and a link to the recording in the next few days, so no pressure to take notes the whole time. At this time, I would like to introduce you all to Andrew Buck, our content strategist here at Mighty Citizen, who will be leading our webinar today. Andrew brings 18 years of experience in nonprofit communications and content strategy to our agency, and we're excited for you all to hear from him on this subject. Andrew?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks, Jarrett, for getting us going. So this is You're a Publisher Now, how to foster a culture of content. And I want to start today with something a bit unusual. I hope you all brought cash to the webinar today because I would like to conduct a Mighty Citizen auction. So here's how this is going to work. I am going to show you 3 items, and you are going to bid on what you would pay for those items. Of course, we're doing this virtually. This is a bit of a put on, so we're not actually expecting you to pay for this, but we're going to play along, right? Okay, here we go. Starting with the first item on the block, a tiny little old jar of mayonnaise. What would you be willing to pay for that? There's a penny there to give you a little sense of scale, but this is the kind of mayonnaise jar you might get with room service in a hotel. And the question is, would you pay $5 for this? Would you pay $10 for this? Maybe even more. So think about that long and hard. What would you be willing to pay for this beautiful jar of mayonnaise? Okay, now while you're thinking about that, we're going to move on to item number 2. Now, item number 2 is for the boomers in the webinar today because it is a peace and love hippie teddy bear figurine, quite small, but quite intricately adorned, I might say. And so again, would we start at $5? We start $20, $30 maybe for something like this? Okay. All right, finally, the third item, probably my favorite item, and the one I suspect will go for the greatest amount, and it is the world's saddest egg whisk. This is a plastic egg that is actually used to beat other eggs, and I think that's a bit cruel, if you ask me, but it's quite adorable. So do I hear the bidding starting at 20, 25, 50, 100? All right. So now that we've thought through these 3 wonderful items, I have something to share. And what I have to share is that these 3 items were part of an experiment that took place several years ago by a journalist by the name of Rob Walker. Now, what Rob did was he went onto eBay and he purchased a number of what he called insignificant objects, very small, very cheap things. In fact, he bought 200 of these items and paid a total of $250. So you can imagine how cheap each item was. But then what he did was he contacted a bunch of authors and writers of different sorts, and he said, if I sent you one of these objects, would you please write a story about it, or write up a really fantastic description for this object? And once he had his 200 authors and the 200 objects went out, he collected all the items and their stories and descriptions back from all these writers, and he put these objects back up onto eBay to sell. And so the question is, how much did these 200 insignificant objects sell for, now that the only difference was that they were a bit older and they had a better written description or story to go with them? Usually when I do this presentation, people guess 500, 1,000, 2,000, and they're usually shocked to discover that Rob sold those 200 items for about $8,000. That's pretty astounding, if you ask me. And the reason that those insignificant items became significant is because of content. So content, right? It's a word, we talk about it, we hear it, we read it, it's all over the blogs, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that everything is content. Everything that your organization does is content. And that goes obviously from the big things like your website and emails you send in your social media, down to smaller interactions, whether it's something you print for your members or a brochure you share with prospective students at your university or an annual report you give to your donors. But it goes all the way down, of course, to interactions that you have personally with your various audiences. So if everything is content, then it becomes really important for us as professional communicators and marketers, which I'm assuming most of you are, to really get a hold on the content and make the most of it. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. But I did want to share those 3 items actually sold for the following amounts. The tiny jar of mayonnaise sold for a whopping $51. So if anything were to prove that the power of really well crafted and well placed content is effective, I think it's this experiment. Okay, so real quick about me. Oh, that's not me. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. But these are 3 people I want to introduce you to. You probably recognize the name. That's Gutenberg, William Randolph Hearst, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. These 3 people are 3 of the most popular, or famous, I should say, or impactful publishers in the history of publishing at different times, obviously, but all saw the value of really putting out into the world content in one form or another. And the good news is that, of course, today we're going to try to bring you into that company if you aren't already there. And we're going to figure out how we can begin to create more, get more out of our content, and make it work for our organization. This is me looking quite coy, if you ask me. I am a content strategist here at Mighty Citizen. For those of you who don't know, Mighty Citizen is a full service marketing, branding, and web design agency. We're located here in Austin, Texas. I've been doing this work for about 18 years now. And I'm really excited. I get really excited when I get to talk about content in all of its various forms and permutations. So even after this session is over, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly, because like I said, I tend to geek out over talking this stuff out with various folks. So with that in mind, this is the agenda that we're going to cover over the next 40 to 45 minutes or so. We want to start by identifying why content is even key. Why are we spending time talking about this on a Thursday afternoon? Then we're going to talk about how we can form a content squad, even on a budget. We're going to talk a little bit about how to find and create more content. And then finally, once we actually create something for our organization, how do we leverage it to get the most bang for our buck? Okay, so with that in mind, let's start with a little bit of a poll here. And I guess we could use maybe the questions window in your webinar there to do this, because I'm always really curious. We've got a few hundred people on the call today, so I'm always really curious about a few things. Curious if, and you could just type yes or check mark or X or something like that, if you find the idea of becoming a content publisher daunting or stressful. Usually when I ask this question, a lot of hands shoot up when we're doing this live in a room, because I feel like over the last 10 years, the notion of content or content strategy or content marketing has really settled in to various industries like associations and nonprofits and universities and government agencies. We kind of caught on to the value to some extent of it. But now that we've gotten more used to it, we turn to more tactical, practical questions like, how do we actually do this day to day in our organizations? Okay, how many of you have a blog? You can either type yes or blog or something like that. Again, lots of hands often shoot up here. When someone doesn't raise their hand here, usually my response is, that's the very first thing you should do when you get back to your office, is start a blog. And again, you don't have to call it a blog, but you need a platform for your organization by which your audiences come to expect regular content being produced. And a blog is sort of the shorthand for that, but it can take different forms. It can be through email, of course, but you want to find a steady easy, flexible, responsive way to share what you have to say with the world. All right, next question. If you, show of hands, if you have published more than 4 pieces of content per month, and that's a rough number. You could get in there if you do 3 or even 2. Um, but I would say that this is a nice, solid goal for us as communicators to pursue, right? 4 pieces of content. And we'll talk about a little bit later. Content isn't always words, of course. It often is words, but it isn't always. So 4 doesn't have to seem quite as daunting as it might at first blush. And finally, I'm curious if you publish a video this year. Again, along with content marketing, we hear video marketing constantly. I know many of you are probably regularly contacted by video marketing vendors who are looking to get your business, because we understand that video seems to have a really strong place. But video is an interesting thing for an organization to handle. How do we do it? How do we produce it? Where do we publish it? That might be the most important question of all. Okay, so I'm going to huddle with Jared later to get those responses. But the point here that I want to make is that it's a really dynamic, complex subject, and we're going to begin to sort of dig into it today. And I would argue that the way we dig into it is through this thesis. If this presentation has a theme, it is that you as an organization need to create a lot more valuable, beautiful content than you are right now. I'll let that sit for just a second. And as we'll see towards the end of this presentation, when we say create, that can be repurposing and re-leveraging existing content. In fact, it probably should be that. But whether it's something we're creating from whole cloth originally, or something that we're reforming or repurposing or repromoting, we need to be creating and sharing a lot more valuable, beautiful content. And I would add that those adjectives are really intentional. Valuable meaning, of course, the people that we want to consume it find some real use, learning in it. And beautiful, as we'll talk about here in a minute, because design is more important to the stickiness and impact of your content than you may initially give it credit for. And before we jump into the rest of the presentation, I want to take a side street here to talk about what I might call the perils of mission-focused organizations when it comes to their approach to content strategy and public communications. These are things I've seen over the course of my career. I've certainly contributed some of these things at different points in my career, but in my role now, working with mission-focused organizations primarily, I've seen these patterns emerge and repeat. The first is that often organizations feel entitled to their audience's attention and money because they are mission focused. There's an assumption that because we're doing good for the world, we're not just another for-profit entity, then people should be more likely to give us their attention and money. In fact, it's imperative that they do. That, of course, as you can see when it's spelled out on the screen there, is probably not quite true. And even if it is true that we feel like we should get a little more attention, it doesn't mean that we don't have to do the serious and sometimes taxing work of managing our content marketing efforts. Another thing I notice is that a lot of organizations, and I would say this is especially true for nonprofit organizations and associations, they deal in data less than they deal in stories. We're going to talk about stories here in just a minute, but the thing about data I've noticed is that while it is important and often required of you to create, generate, share data, the way in which we're sharing data often makes it completely uncompelling to our audiences. If we're a nonprofit and we want to share the number of people we helped last year, then we need to think of more creative, interesting ways to share that so that it's impactful and it's not just a number sitting on a page. And then finally, it's just a matter of volume. You know, again, I'll probably repeat this a few times, but we just have to be creating more. And one of the reasons we have to create more, by the way, is because attention is at a premium right now. The amount of content making its way onto the internet every 60 seconds versus the short attention span of our users, the competition we have, mean that we have to fight our way through the glut. And one way to do that is making sure that we're producing a lot more regularly. So let's dig into that a little more. 4 quick reasons why you should do this. And if you're in your organization, you're thinking, yes, Andrew, I totally agree with this. In fact, I already knew all of this, but how do I sell this up in my organization? Maybe we're a small group. Maybe I'm a 1-person team or a 2 or 3-person team. We don't have the resources that we need to do all this creation and sharing of content. Well, hopefully this section will offer you some additional arguments to have when you go to your supervisors or bosses and try to explain why y'all need to really make this investment in your marketing content. Gary Vaynerchuk, who many of you probably know and who I find pretty fascinating. I don't always agree with everything he says, but I definitely agree with the bulk of it. And I definitely agree with this here, where he says, content is the gateway drug of small organizations, meaning this is your way in to the conversation. We talk very nebulously as professional marketers a lot about engagement and having a conversation, but practically what that means is lending to that conversation. And the way you lend, the way you hold up your part of that bargain is by offering, again, valuable, beautiful stuff. So the first reason is that this is how you actually become a thought leader. That's another term, of course, that gets used probably too much, thought leadership. We as an organization want to be thought leaders. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to actually create thoughts. If you search thought leader, by the way, on Google, you get about 356 million search results. And it's definitely not enough just to claim it. Again, this goes back to that notion of like, are we as organizations just constantly making claims to our various audiences, or are we telling stories and sharing helpful information? So again, content, whether that's a blog article, an email, a social media post, or video, what have you, is how your audiences will evaluate the quality of your ideas. Thought leadership only comes to organizations that produce thoughts. By the way, I'll also add that it reduces cognitive load. I would say that maybe one of the 2 or 3 most important things we can do as professional communicators and marketers is reduce the cognitive load. That is, make it as easy and straightforward and simple as possible to interact with us. Even above coming up with really clever design or really clever messages or a website that does all sorts of fancy things. Even more important than that stuff is just making it easy. Remember, tiny attention spans, lots of competition out there for that attention too. So how do you fight that? You make it easy. When things are not easy, people tend to disengage. Now, the pro tip here is that you really can align yourself with other groups with a trusted reputation. If you're a small team, especially, one way to re-leverage your stuff is to publish it elsewhere. So if you're writing a blog or a white paper, research report, or an annual report, are there other organizations in your space, associations, etc., that have a decent enough reputation online that would be willing to share your content? Quick and easy way to grow your audience, grow your potential audience anyway, without a huge budget to invest in advertisement. All right, second reason you need to be doing this, it's simple as this. You need to drive more online traffic. More online traffic equals more conversions, however you define a conversion, a donation, an application, a volunteer sign up, etc. By the way, I would encourage us to think of content as an ecosystem. This is another one of those kind of terms that gets thrown around a lot, but it is one that I actually kind of buy into, which is it's really easy to get a little myopic, a little can't see the forest for the trees in our day-to-day work. But to the extent that we can, we want to constantly be reminding ourselves that this thing I'm creating or this thing I'm putting out there is part of a large ecosystem of content. In fact, we also offer some webinars and some great blog articles at Mighty Citizen about content governance. So how do we get our hands around everything that we're creating to make sure it's accurate and on brand and it sings and it's working? By the way, you should invest in more flexible website design. What I mean by that is what we might call modular web design, so that when you have something you want to share with the world or something you want to create, it's easy for you to put that online in a way that is as compelling and simple to access as possible. A lot of websites, especially among mission focused organizations, are very locked down, meaning they don't have the flexibility of moving things around, having different interactions, creating a different user experience. So consider that. By the way, I know I keep saying by the way, everything's by the way. Mobile responsive isn't really good enough. It has to be mobile friendly. It's no longer, and by the way, this isn't me saying this, is Google saying this. Google will ping you hard if your mobile website isn't very responsive or isn't friendly, let alone responsive. So one little side note here, perform keyword research to generate content ideas, then write to them. We can't really get into SEO, but by the way, the future of content is SEO. If you don't know how to appear in first page of Google search results, let alone the top three, you might as well kind of not exist to the audiences you're trying to target. So take the time, go do your keyword research. Again, Mighty Citizen is happy to offer some free resources on our website about how that might happen, but then go create the best content you can around those ideas. You need to go where the people are searching rather than writing whatever it is you want and hoping they find you. Third reason to invest in more content, kind of a culture of content in your organization, is really just, this kind of goes without saying, right? We want to stay top of mind. Here, let me ask these questions, and maybe in the chat box. How often do you think about your organization? I would say that for most of you on this webinar today, you probably think about your organization roughly 40 hours a week, the 40 hours you're in the office, and maybe a little bit more when you're at home at night worrying about something. So the question is, how does that compare to how often your audience thinks of your organization, which is roughly 0 hours per week, right? I'm being a little cheeky here, but the point I'm trying to make is that if we are to get the people we want to pay attention to us in any real way, and the only way we can get that 0 up to maybe 0.5 or 1 hour a week is through content. It's advertising is not what it used to be, right? And advertising now is just another word for content. You should share your content more often than you think you should. I might repeat this later, but it's such an important point, okay? I was guilty of this for many years in my career. In fact, I think on this webinar is a former supervisor of mine from way back in my career, and he can probably attest to this. But we would, create a marketing campaign or create this really great piece of content or send out all these great emails. And we would do that for, a month, 3 months, 6 months. And then internally, as the communicators, as the people kind of trying to make this happen, we would get bored with the idea. I mean, again, we're spending 40 hours a week thinking about it. So we kind of naturally get bored with that thing. So we go and change it up. All right, now we're going to do something new. The problem is that just about the time we get bored with something we're putting out into the world is the time when it might start catching on a little bit, right? Your audience doesn't think about you nearly as much as you do, so it's imperative on you to keep reminding them. It might feel a little boring sometimes on your side of things when you've been running the same campaign for a year and a half, but as long as you're tracking the metrics and the effectiveness, then you should continue with it as long as it's working. Last thing is something we might call the curse of knowledge. I talk about this in pretty much every talk I give because I think it's relevant across this entire profession. The curse of knowledge says that once you know something, it's impossible to imagine what it was like not to know that thing. The picture here is a person drumming their fingers because there's a great experiment where you can prove this. If you go home tonight to your kids or your partner or your friends, your neighbors or what have you, try this little experiment. Tap out the Star Spangled Banner on the table, or use your knuckles to knock it on the table. Don't hum it, don't sing it, don't tell them what you're doing. Just tap out the Star Spangled Banner and then ask them if they know what song it is you're tapping out. they 100% guaranteed will not know what song it is. And that's the curse of knowledge at work. While you're tapping, you have the knowledge, you have the context, you can almost hear the song playing in your head. But because they don't have the context or the reference or the experience, they don't. So, content marketing, that is the production of valuable, beautiful content, is a way for us to sort of circumvent to some extent the curse of knowledge, in part because as we create more, we learn more about what works and what doesn't. And we have to learn that often what we start with, where we begin our ideas or how we begin a blog is already beyond the interest or comprehension of the people we're trying to reach. A good example of this is how some universities on their website talk about prospective students versus future students, right? Same word, or two words that mean essentially the same thing, but one word is very obvious. The other one, for some users, might not be as clear. Okay, so let's now talk about your content team. Who are the people who are going to make this happen day to day? And I would argue that there's three key components of any sort of content marketing team. Now, you go to a big organization, an AT&T, a Time Warner, an Apple, what have you, they probably have 1,000 of each of these people. I'm assuming most of you aren't in that position, but you need a managing editor, a writer, and a designer. Now, I should say that sometimes you find one person who can play both roles pretty well. Ideally, though, they would be three different people in order to increase your output. So we have the managing editor, the writer, and the designer. I want to talk about each one just in a little bit of detail so we understand. This is the one that might be most foreign to your organization. We all know what a writer and a designer is, but what is a managing editor? Well, this goes back to the title of this presentation, which is you're a publisher now, right? We have to sort of adopt some of the thinking and maybe even the language of publishing companies who do have managing editors, right? Managing editors really is the linchpin of your content marketing strategy. Their role is to generate ideas and to project manage. Here at Mighty Citizen, where we try to put out a lot of stuff, we have a project manager and a project coordinator dedicated only to that effort, right? So they're helping make sure that all the steps and workflows are in place and are being abided by in order for us to meet our goal. Now, managing editors should really be obsessive about details, deadline conscious, and it's great if they have copy editing chops, if they're able to turn a really good draft of something into a really great draft. Side note, if they're egoless, that's fantastic, because they need to sort of, it's their job to generate ideas, but it doesn't mean that everything gets accepted. So you need someone who's kind of constantly fueling the fire, but not getting defensive. Now, the writer, we all know what a writer is. And this is a saying that I, for a long time, had on my LinkedIn. It might actually still be there. I don't remember. When all else is equal, hire the better writer, right? If you're, regardless of the role you're hiring for, always hire the better writer. Obviously, the writer is the producer of content. You want curiosity. You want someone who's very readable, who understands how to talk to your audience. Do you know the average reading level in America is eighth grade? Eighth grade. So that means that even if your audience is highly technical or highly educated, you should be writing below or around an eighth grade level. So you need a writer who kind of understands those things. So not only are they writing in a way that reduces cognitive load, but of course, it's interesting, it stands out. There's so much bland, generic, general content being produced. If you can find a writer who can talk in specifics and examples and have dynamic language, you should hire that person. They need some flexibility, of course, and again, the egolessness helps here, although finding an egoless writer is probably impossible. But if they can really accept editing, that'll really speed up your process. And then finally, we have the designer. So this is a nice to have, but increasingly it's becoming a must have. And I say nice to have because I know that for a lot of organizations, they're not going to dedicate the resources right now to hiring a marketing designer who just works with your marketing and communications teams. But listen, 65% of people are visual learners. And the internet is becoming increasingly image and photo dependent, even as more sort of word-based platforms become popular. we still find a need to stand out in the glut of content through really great design. My boss, Rachel, often says that, design is no longer a luxury, it's the cost of doing business. It's the cost of entry into the market. Again, you want someone who's user focused. Hopefully they're social media savvy, because often the stuff they'll be designing for is sharing your content on social. And of course, it's great if they have some real technical chops and can work on different design platforms. Here's the thing, if you can't have a designer right now, maybe you can contract one out part-time. Maybe you can borrow a designer for 10 hours a month from another department. Or maybe you can just begin making the case for why you should hire a designer. This doesn't have to be someone highly senior, it can be someone relatively junior. But a designer is going to take what is good content from good to great. So please consider making that case. Quick note about content marketing on budget. We kind of talked about it throughout, small teams, 1, 2, 3 person teams, how do you do it? That's the first step. Again, it seems a little self-interested of me to keep talking about how great writers are. But no, you really do need to hire a writer, because even though you're going to be creating great designs and images and videos and whatnot, at the end, you need a great written message in various forms. And a great writer is going to get you there. And I emphasize great, okay? If you're going to hire somebody, maybe give them a writing sample to give you. This is interesting. Quantity over quality. It is more important for a smaller organization, or at least an organization with a burgeoning or small marketing and communications team, to produce more content than spending a lot of time producing better content. And it goes back to what I said a few slides ago about how the way we're going to overcome that curse of knowledge, the way we're going to be able to better engage and create a conversation with people out there that we don't know through space and time on the internet, is by creating more and keeping a close eye on how the content performs. And in fact, for the content squad, we could probably add a fourth person, which is like a Google Analytics expert, right? But we want to see how their content performs so we can figure out what to spend time creating. I would argue that another quick way to compete with the glut of content out there is just through sheer quantity. Now, obviously, we have to have standards. We can't put out anything that is really off brand or that has a bunch of typos. So there's some workflows you've got to build in there to make sure things reach a sort of minimum standard of quality. But right now, for small teams, quantity over quality. Video is cheap. Most of us have smartphones. Most of them have fantastic cameras. It's really that simple. And by the way, use the resources you have. I've seen organizations where there were 1 or 2 marketing people, but they were really great at creating relationships with the other people in the organization and other departments, other teams, completely unrelated departments and teams, and ask them to help creating content, generating ideas. So if you already have those relationships, or if you're sort of building those relationships internally, you might be surprised that just asking them to help will produce some real results. By the way, target your ad spend. If you are spending money on Google ads, like search ads, for example, get really targeted with it, because if you're not targeted enough, you're wasting money and you're paying too much for your clicks. And again, feel free to email me if you want to talk more about this whole content marketing on a budget thing. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how to find content. And I'm borrowing some of this from another presentation you can find on our site, another recorded webinar about storytelling for impact. But I think it's important to remind ourselves of this, even if we kind of know it instinctively. And that is, certain plots never fail, right? So you might be sitting there going, content, content, content. You won't shut up about content. Well, where do I, what should I be creating? And I would say stories. And I know storytelling is very buzzy in the marketing world, but they really, they really work. They truly actually work. What I should say is they work a lot better than claim making, which is what a lot of us organizations do. We make claims. We are this, we do this. That is not nearly as engaging sort of psychologically at a sort of fundamental level with audiences as storytelling. And the good news is there are certain plots that if you tell these stories again and again and again, people will never notice that you're telling the same plot because the details change and the stories are great. So I'm going to tell you these three. The first is David versus Goliath. I probably don't have to explain what this is to most of you. Classic underdogs. We love stories of people overcoming the odds. Find those stories and tell them. For mission-focused organizations, this is remarkably easy. When I've worked with, for-profit companies, they find this a little bit tougher, but you are probably brimming with stories of people who've done amazing things despite circumstances saying that they shouldn't or wouldn't. And again, because the details change, people won't, your audience is never going to come to you and say, I don't want to engage with you. I don't want to do business. I don't want to send my kid to your school. I want to donate to your cause because you keep telling these underdog stories. It just won't happen. So use these tricks. The second plot is what you might call odd couples. This is why we watch YouTube videos of cats riding on the back of pigs for 10 minutes, right? We love stories of two people or groups bridging some sort of gap. That gap could be geographical. In this image, it could be based on your species. It could be based on gender or ethnicity or socioeconomic status or education or points of view, whatever. We love when people who shouldn't initially come together do come together to, pursue something greater than themselves. I see this a lot in the university setting where we see stories of professors and students sort of bridging some sort of gap to do something greater. Often different student organizations that team up to do something wonderful together. And the third is what I might call the MacGyver. The MacGyver, for those of you who are too young to remember, MacGyver was a TV character in the 80s and 90s who was kind of a secret agent. But what he would do is he would always solve a problem by sheer ingenuity, right? He could make a bomb out of like toothpaste and a paperclip. He was always coming up with these contraptions at the last second. The point here is we love stories about people who use innovation or new thinking or loopholes in the system to do something new or to do something old in a new way. Think of Isaac Newton, right? Isaac Newton, with the apple falls on his head, he kind of helps him realize gravity. Of course, that story is probably not true, but we still love the story because we love hearing stories of people or groups who suddenly are trying something new in a new way. So look for those three plots. Another thing you should do is every time you have a team meeting, and I assume most of you have some sort of staff or team meeting once a week or once a month or something, ask these three questions. One, who did we turn away last week? We turned them away for a reason, I'm sure, whatever turn away means in your instance, but we turn them away for a reason, but why? There's a story there. Ask the follow-up questions, but start with that question. Whom did we turn away last week? Number two, whom can't we forget? Someone, a client, a donor, a member, a student, a constituent. Someone is sticking in your head for one reason or another. Well, why? There's a reason they're sticking in your head, and that reason might be a really great story, a source of content. And finally, number three, who's our favorite client or donor, volunteer, student, member, faculty, etc. Who's the person we just love for one reason or another? And by the way, it can sometimes be someone even on your staff, of course. But why do we like them so much? Again, content there, story there. So much content I see, sort of big ticket content, are like white papers and research reports, which are great. But to make them most compelling, you have to add humanity into them. Make your claims and share your data through the lens of a story. All right, last section here before we eventually turn to some questions. And this is, we're just scratching the surface here. I should point that out. We could spend an entire 2 or 3 hour webinar, I'm sure, talking more about how to make the most of out of our content, because there's so many channels out there and tactics and ways to make your workflows more efficient. But I wanted to introduce you to the pyramid approach. And the pyramid approach, this is like a bit of a variation on something that Gary Vaynerchuk has really championed and that we use here at Mighty Citizen, and it found it to be pretty successful. And as we've introduced it to some of our clients, I think the light bulb is going off for them. Like, this is a way for us to really leverage the time we do have and get more out of it. So the pyramid approach basically says this. First, you spend the time creating a long form piece of content. That can be a white paper, a podcast, a video, a really long series of blog articles, what have you. Now, you may say, but Andrew, doesn't this contradict what you said a minute ago about quantity over quality? I would argue that that's quality over quantity is especially true for very small teams that don't have a lot of time or resources to devote to content creation and publication. But even if you are in a small team, if you do spend the time at the beginning to create the long form, then suddenly the quantity picks up because of the pyramid approach. The pyramid approach allows you to turn one piece into many pieces. So you start by creating the long form piece of content. And by the way, that should be valuable and beautiful, okay? Then you start slicing and dicing and turning the long form content into shorter forms, articles, images, quotes, memes. And then you begin to distribute the content through email, through your website, through social media. Those are, of course, your three primary channels. So that's the pyramid approach. Now I want to show you how it might actually work in a couple of scenarios. So let's say that you're a nonprofit and your mission is health advocacy. So using the pyramid approach, we could say, we're going to start a monthly podcast. We're going to get our executive director and our operations manager and a couple of our clients into a room for a couple hours once a month. We're going to record a podcast. It's healthy in an hour, right? Once we do that, we can turn that podcast into at least 3 or 4 blog articles. By the way, a little short pro tip here, get a translation service. They're really affordable. And if you're doing video or audio content, send them the file. A day or two later, they send you back the full transcription, which makes turning it into written content infinitely easier. And maybe you create memes. This is something that Vaynerchuk often talks about, and I've really come around to his point of view on this, which is that memes, that is, images and GIFs that are sort of hoped to become virally shared, are totally acceptable forms of content. Now, the question is, how do you brand it? How do you connect a meme to your organization? Well, that's a little bit of a more dynamic question with different answers, although a designer sure would help there. And then it's like, how do we distribute this content? Well, we're going to send one blog every week via email to this part of our constituency, or maybe our entire audience. We're going to put the memes on social, the 3 big ones right now: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So that's one sort of example of how the pyramid might work. Here's another one. Let's say you're the law school at a large public university. Well, you might decide to do a monthly video address from the president of the law review, right? This is just an example, but the idea is, how are we going to get one big thing that we can drift off? So a little 5-minute video where we sit down with the president of the law review and they talk about, they answer questions, or they talk about the latest in the news, what have you. That's going to be at least a couple blog articles. And because we have video, we can do GIFs or GIFs. I'm a GIF guy. I don't know why I said GIF right there. I'm embarrassed. And then we distribute it. We put it on YouTube. We put it on Vimeo. We create clips with captions, please. And then maybe we do some comic style illustration posted across social. This is where you can begin to get creative. The pyramid approach allows you to get a little more creative, because instead of having to generate smaller pieces whole cloth, we've got this big chunk of ideas that we can then slice and dice in numerous ways. So we can be a bit more diverse in our thinking there. Finally, last example, let's say you're a professional association of dog walkers. Well, you could write a white paper called The 10 Biggest Mistakes New Dog Walkers Make. okay? It's, you know, a nice 8-page PDF, maybe print them too. Great design, really helpful, great resources. But then you can turn each of the mistakes in your list there into a standalone blog article. You can create an amazing infographic. Lists are great for infographics. And of course, memes, always an option. And then maybe you post one meme per day to your social. You know, a white paper, an 8-page white paper can probably produce a dozen memes. That's a lot of content. Create a slide share and post it to LinkedIn. Maybe you put the infographic together and send it an email. Make sure it's on your homepage as well. Listen, it's not about the specific ideas here. I hope some of them maybe resonate with you. But again, it's just showing you how we start with something big, we slice it down and begin sharing relentlessly. Distribution more important than creation, by the way. Doesn't matter how wonderful, beautiful, or compelling your content is if you don't distribute it well, because people aren't going to consume it otherwise, right? So we need to be utilizing social, we need to be utilizing email, of course, our website. And that's a conversation for another day. I'm afraid we can't get into that now, but I did want to make this, you know, semi bold statement here. So let's sum all this up, okay? One, you are in the business of content creation now. You are a publisher now, right? And that's because it is the surest way of connecting with your users at scale. I should probably put at scale there, right? The surest way of connecting with your users, I don't know, is knocking on their front door, talking to them, but you're not going to do that, right? Number two, you got to invest in at least one great writer. If you can go a step further and get someone to project manage it, like a managing editor, and really if you can get a designer who works well with your writer, then you're really going to begin to set yourself apart from the competition. And then you need to build content idea generation in your operations. Ask those questions at your staff meeting, etc. And create big pieces. Use that pyramid model that Vaynerchuk introduced. How do we create big pieces of content? And again, you know, leverage that into smaller pieces so that we've got that quantity over quality thing. By the way, we will be emailing you the slide deck from this and a recording of this webinar. But if you're hungry to get it now, you can go to mightycitizen.com/publisher and get them now. Or you can just go to mightycitizen.com/tools, see all the free templates and resources and webinar recordings we have. I want to thank you all for paying attention. I know sometimes webinars go on and on. I hope this was useful. And now we have a little bit of time to pause, and Jarrett has been looking at questions that have come in, and I'll let you ask that, Jarrett.
All right, I have been looking at questions, Andrew. Thank you. Let's jump right on in. Olivia mentioned that she is just overwhelmed with the amount of content that she has to create. So what advice would you have for her?
Oh boy, like, well, you know, it's tough with questions sometimes because it's like I have so many follow-ups. Like when you say you have content you have to create, like says who you have to create it. Is it like you have written down a plan where we're going to produce all this content? Is this coming from somewhere else in the organization saying you, Olivia, have to make all this content? But regardless, I guess, of you know, of where this demand for content comes from, I think a lot of sort of sound traditional professional rules apply. For example, prioritization, saying no, and God, you know, I hope maybe you're a one-person team. You know, if you are overwhelmed, then hopefully the people who make the decisions about how to make you less overwhelmed notice that and are willing to give you some support. But Olivia, oh, by the way, I don't think I gave, okay, my email address, by the way, everybody, is abuck@mightycitizen.com. Andrew Buck is my name, so my email address is abuck@mightycitizen.com. Feel free to email me and we can chat further about it. I'm sorry I don't have a more specific answer for you, Olivia, but prioritization and pushing back is one place I'd be likely to start.
So maybe that's a good segue into this next question about selling up and maybe getting some initiatives in place from your supervisors. So what are some of the first steps a small and scrappy content team can take to optimize their content if we don't have the resources to hire?
Well, again, I probably want to ask what you mean by optimize. So if you mean in the very strictest sense, like for search engines, then I'd say you got to go do your keyword research. There's also a great tool that we've been introduced lately to here at Mighty Citizen called ClearScope that makes SEO keyword research a lot easier and actually kind of fun. It's called ClearScope. But if you're speaking sort of more generally or vaguely about like optimize it to get the, like how do we get the most out of it? Well, I would say look closely at your analytics um, to determine what has worked in the past. Like what are people actually consuming, for example, on your website or on your social media platforms, and start your investigation there. Why was certain content so much better performing than other? Sort of dissect it, sort of reverse engineer it, if you will. And I guess another thing I would say about optimizing content is to get rid of distribution channels that aren't working. Um, because every time you add a new, for example, social media platform that you're going to publish to, it really does add a significant amount of work over time. And you just might not be actually getting any traction on a certain platform. So let it go. Really focus your efforts. I think it's the Pareto. Is it the Pareto principle that says that 80% of the results come from about 20% of your efforts? So really figure out where that 80% of results are coming from, and just do that thing or those things more and more. I hope that answers a little bit.
Andrew, John wants to know if there are any other content creators outside of Gary that you admire.
Oh yeah, thanks, John, for the answer. So I, I guess the answer is yes, there are, but I don't consume a lot of the content marketing evangelists. Like that's what I would consider Gary Vaynerchuk. Listen, I did go through a serious Seth Godin phase last year where I was reading a bunch of his stuff. I think he's pretty great. I moved on from him a little bit. I'm not reading his blog quite as much as I would, but Seth Godin's good. But I like the folks who end up talking about content sort of indirectly. So they're not talking about it in the strictest terms like we are as, marketers, right? But they talk about how do ideas get generated and how do they stick. A great book I would recommend is by Dan and Chip Heath called Made to Stick. Another book that, believe it or not, I've gotten a lot out of is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. These are pretty big books. Many of you probably have encountered them or read them, but I tend to go back to them again and again. And one other thing I'll add, there's a company called Newfangled. I believe they're either in Minnesota or North Carolina, I think. Forgive me for not knowing. They, I think, are some of the best content idea people in the game right now. So Newfangled has a really great blog, and mightycitizen.com.
And Andrew, in terms of that top of the pyramid, the content distribution, Edith wants to know if there's any particular social media that is more effective for distributing nonprofits content to achieve potential donors, and if you have any comments about LinkedIn versus Facebook.
Yes. The famous social media question. Yeah, I love this stuff because my opinions have shifted on this over the years. So the first part of your question, what social media platforms would I recommend for a nonprofit? It absolutely depends on who your target audience is. I mean, if you're trying to do it for fundraising purposes, and for example, that your donors run slightly older, then you're going to go Facebook and email, and maybe still plenty of direct mail. If you are interested in running a campaign that increases the percentage of donors who are younger, then I'm going Instagram. I might even buy ads on Instagram if you have the budget for that. And Snapchat too, of course. TikTok, I haven't gotten to TikTok yet. I need to though, so I can speak about it. But the question of what's the other question? Facebook versus LinkedIn. Again, I think LinkedIn, nonprofits should probably have an account on LinkedIn, but I don't know. I probably wouldn't spend any time as a nonprofit on LinkedIn. It's just not your audience. I hope that's what you were asking. Yeah, one more.
I will do one more, Andrew. Caroline wants to know how much time should be spent on measuring performance versus content development.
Oh, that is a good question, Caroline. Um, so I can tell you what we do here, for starters, here at Mighty Citizen. We keep a pretty close eye on our analytics. We are sort of officially running a series of reports on our analytics at least once a month and talking about them as a team, really kind of digging into the numbers. It helps that we have a couple people on staff who are analytics masters and can really break it all down for us non-analytics masters. But if I were, I don't know, if I were to hazard a guess at like a percentage breakdown between spending time creating and refining content versus examining its effectiveness, it'd be like 90-10 or something like that. I mean, it shouldn't take you too long to figure out what's working and what's not working if you can A, look at your analytics, and B, spend a little bit of time viewing the conversation. One of the things that Gary Vaynerchuk does, again, not to keep going back to this guy, but that I think he does so well is he always sort of asks for feedback when he shares content. You know, so if you put out a social media post that's advertising a page on your site, for example, ask people what they think of it, and not like in a real formal way. Just be like, "Do you find this useful? Let me know in the comments if this was helpful." You won't get probably a ton of engagement that way, but you'll get some, and it's a real conversation, and you can just follow those breadcrumbs. I hope that helps a little bit.
Andrew, thanks so much for another great presentation, and thank you all for attending today. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but again, you can email Andrew. That's abuck@mightycitizen.com, ABUCK. Please remember that we'll be sending out the slides and a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered, and we'll also include a link to a feedback form for our webinar today, and hope you'll take a minute to tell us what you think. If you have any questions about what we talked about today, again, you can email Andrew, or you can email a general email at hello@mightycitizen.com. Thanks again for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.